for the brutal assault and rape of a white woman who became known across the world as the Central Park Jogger. The trial of the young men who were called the Central Park Five in the courts and in the media became one of the most famous of the 20th century. These young brothers, Yusef Salaam, Corey Wise, Antron McRae, Kevin Richardson, and Raymond Santana, were forced to live out their youth behind bars. And they were only exonerated and released after a convicted murderer and serial rapist in prison confessed to the crime and DNA evidence confirmed his guilt. Now, for those of you who had joined us last week for the conversation with doctors Chris Emden and Donique Dali, you were in for a special treat. We focused heavily on the larger theme and question around the role of education, given the realities that the young men faced and those truths and challenges that still exist today. And we talked with great passion and detail about the responsibility those of us have that have accepted the mantle to serve young people in communities of color. Tonight, I'll share by saying, I'm here for my son. Now, when I first heard these words and when they see us, I couldn't fully relate, but I knew that millions of women felt the full weight of them. They're 5 simple words, but they reveal a determination to protect and a fear of what's to come. They remind us of the countless stories we've heard of Black and brown mothers who've said this or similar at a police precinct after learning of their son's arrest, and probably most frequently at school after receiving word that there may have been an issue or an incident. Women who know all too well what can happen to their baby, whose only goal is to get their boy home as quickly and safely as possible. So for tonight's conversation, we have 3 phenomenally brilliant leaders who will be engaging in a dialogue around the events of the series. We'll hear how they, as women, as leaders, as educators, as mothers and mother figures, experience those events. All right, so a bit about our format for those of you that weren't able to join us last week. First, for those of you on Zoom, we ask and strongly encourage you to have a conversation with each other via the chat option in the Zoom. Talk about what it is that you're hearing, what is resonating with you, and what questions you have and where you may feel you need support. You can also directly post questions for any of us via the Zoom chat by using the Q&A option on your Zoom panel, which is being monitored by my colleague and accomplice for this series, Mr. Chris Jackson. We also encourage the hundreds of folks that are going to be on Facebook Live watching to do the same. Big Picture Learning Co-Executive Director Andrew Frischman will be monitoring the Facebook Live chat for all of us during this conversation and posting related links. Once again, I'd like to extend my deepest appreciation to all of you for your understanding and grace in advance. In the event that we have experienced any technology issues or challenges, I think we've covered them and kind of addressed any of the ones that we may have had last week. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you all to our incredible panel. First, we have Dinah Becton Consuegra. Dinah is Director of Partnership Development for PBL Works. Dinah was formerly the West Regional Director for EL Education, where she supported a network of 32 schools across 6 states. Closing the opportunity gap has been the primary driver in Dinah's 20 years in education. Dinah has served in various leadership capacities for districts, schools, and nonprofits. She's worked with districts in California and Hawaii, advocating for Black and Latinx youth impacted by the opportunity gap. Her focus was on examining the systems that lead to educational inequities by uncovering data and convening focus groups to gain an understanding of equity and access across the instructional program. Her previous roles have been school turnaround consultant, high school principal, and executive director of family and community engagement. Welcome, Dinah.
Thank you, Carlos. It's an honor to be here tonight.
Honor to have you. We also have with us Dr. Charmaine Mercer. Charmaine is a program officer in education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation, Charmaine was a director and senior researcher for the Learning Policy Institute, where she led a small team of dedicated researchers, policy advocates, and communication specialists. In a previous role, she served as the vice president for standards assessment and deeper learning at the Alliance for Excellent Education, a national policy and advocacy organization that focuses on secondary schools. Charmaine has held various positions on Capitol Hill, including as a senior staffer for the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and related agencies, a senior staffer for the Education and Labor Committee, and a researcher for the Congressional Research Service. Welcome, Charmaine.
Thank you. Thank you. Excited to be a part.
Awesome. And lastly, we have Dr. Wisdom Powell. Wisdom is director of the Health Disparities Institute and associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Connecticut. Formerly, Wisdom spent over a decade at UNC Chapel Hill's Gilling School of Global Public Health, where she held a tenured appointment in the Department of Health Behavior and was a research associate professor and associate director of the Center for Health Equity Research in the Department of Social Medicine. In 2011 through 2012, she was appointed by President Obama to serve as a White House fellow to Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. In this role, she provided subject matter expertise on military mental health, such as PTSD, suicide, and military sexual trauma. Her community-based domestic and global research focuses on the role of modern racism and gender norms on Black male health outcomes and healthcare inequities. Welcome, Wisdom.
Thank you, Carlos.
An honor. So we'll dive right in because we have an hour and we have a lot to discuss. Just want to restate my appreciation to all of you for your willingness and excitement to join us for this conversation. We've all watched the series, and I know we've all had very strong reactions to this series. And I think in our previous conversations, we have noted that relationships are a clear thread within the series. And those that exist between the boys and the moms and the sons and their moms. Was hoping that just to kind of table set for us a little bit, using a scene from the series, if each of us could describe, and maybe starting with you, Dinah, maybe describe a scene from the series that describes one of the relationships that resonated the most with you and why that was.
Sure, be happy to start. Thank you, Carlos. So many scenes. I mean, what a powerful series Maeva put together. I think the scenes that really resonated for me came in episode 3, at the beginning of the episode, particularly when you see Raymond's family and Antron's family just come in and see their sons, behind bars, and just sort of those conversations that were had. And the one that particularly struck a chord was Antron's mother. I forget sort of what the dialogue was, but it was something like Antron just basically says, the whole world hates us. And just her response was just, something like, I love you, and that's enough to make up for everybody. And she just said all of these other words, right? And just, I thought about so much during that time, particularly Ava's magic of moms and magic in words that she gave, right? That they were able to say these things to string them together and to hold the boys together just enough. It resonated for me because, oh man, it's been about 3 years, and I had a younger brother who spent about 7 years in federal prison. And my mother and I went to visit him multiple times. And one in particular was just such a mirror for this movie that it just really just hit my heart, which was the search process that we went through. And, I kind of knew what to expect. I'd been, in to visit other family members. But her difficulty and her first time, and just it was her son, right, and my brother, she didn't respond well to it, and she let the guards know how unfair and brutal she thought people were being treated. And I got it, and part of me is trying to hold her back and get her to just be silent and let us see our brother. And then the other part of me was like, tell them the truth, right? And so they kind of threatened us and said, we're never going to allow you in here again. And she was just really struck, right? And we got in there and we have a conversation, and you look around and nothing but Black and brown faces. And you see abuelas, you see little babies who can barely walk. And I just think to myself, like, this is impacting communities, villages, right? This is impacting babies in the womb all the way through women and men who are in their 80s and 90s. And so that really resonated, right? That hope and power that you hold, and that incredible unconditional love that you have, right? For folks just behind bars and just in your life, and the power that mothers have to be able to keep their kids sane throughout this process.
It is any of us that have had family members that have been incarcerated know that when someone is incarcerated, the entire family to a degree is incarcerated as well. Wisdom, is there a scene that resonated for you I'm sure there is a scene that resonated for you, but is there one in particular that you'd like to share and discuss?
Wow, there's so much to unpack here. And Diana, thank you for your comments, because it lifted up for me, again, the real reality that while we're viewing this film as something separate from us, we are all a part of this narrative. We all have family members who are locked up and really buried alive, essentially. And I think for me, there were so many moments in the film where I felt at a deep empathic level the pain that the mothers were experiencing, just seeing their sons be behind those bars, behind those glass screens, that inability to touch them, to love them, to show them physical comfort. And I remember the moment when Yusef's mother is sitting on the couch with a friend after, leaving court. And she says she's watching this video reel of Donald Trump talking about the boys. And she says in this really pained voice, they want to kill my son. And I don't know about you, but that struck me in the gut, because I didn't just think about her. I thought about all the mothers of young men who have been killed over time systematically by police officers, by lynch mobs, and that sense of helplessness you feel when you know that someone wants to harm your baby and there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that sense of deprivation, threat, loss is so maternally felt by and displayed in the film by the women in the film, that I just, for me, it was just this moment where I started to think about how many other mothers are in that position, and how much loss and deep longing that they feel when their children are snatched away from them in that way. And similar to Dinah and other folks who will probably, chime in to this question, we all have family members who have been swept up in this criminal justice system. And I will not call up the name of the person, but there's a member of my family whose son went to prison. And I remember her calling me, and I remember the sound in her voice. And the one thing she focused on, not on the fact that he had been incarcerated or been arrested, she was like, he doesn't have his glasses. My son won't be able to see. I mean, these are, just the kinds of, pain that can't really be quantified, that mothers and women around the village of boys and men of color who are swept up in this enormous tragedy, right, that we feel.
It was striking. That scene with Sharon Salam that you're referencing was indeed a powerful one. And there's so many things that can be overlooked in terms of the different support networks that each one of the moms, and even in the case of Santana's father and grandmother, right, having different support networks around. It's just an invaluable piece of kind of like the fabric of especially the Black and brown families and needing those supports and how they rally together. I think there's a narrative that's often existent that perhaps doesn't exist, but we know that it's there. Charmaine, would love to hear your voice and thoughts on a scene that you'd like to share and talk about.
Good wisdom. And Dinah, thank you both for sharing. The scene that really stuck with me because I feel like it's a thread that just continues throughout was at one point, Corey and Yusuf, it was really Corey, was about to get arrested. And I'm making sure I'm getting that Yusuf was about to get arrested. And Corey decided to go with him. And I remember he said to him, I got to go with you because if I don't, your mom's is going to get me when I get back. So I might as well go with you now. And I remember being like that kid. I was always the one that my friends' parents were always like, of course, like, how did you make it back? But they not. And I was always the one expected to explain on behalf of all of my friends. And so therefore you stay together. And you stay together because that's just what you do, or that's what you did, or that's what you do. I'm still that friend. And it was the loyalty. And then you watched throughout, as I felt, the loyalty was almost being used against him at different moments, right? Because he was the only one that was old enough, technically, to be treated as an adult. So then the whole experience ended up being wildly different for him. And then I remember when Yusuf's mom came to get him, Corey had fallen asleep on the bench and no one saw him and no one knew. And he was just there by himself. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like somebody's got to come back and get him because the dynamic that existed between him and his mom was different than the dynamic that was between Yusuf and his mom. And so I just remember just to continue to watch that. And then it comes back later because Corey's mom is really trying to speak to Yusuf's mom to leverage that friendship because their friendship was so close. The other thing that was notable was that they were the only ones who actually knew each other when all of this started and had like a true, authentic relationship. And he felt like the mom knew, Corey's mom certainly knew and tried to leverage that, but there was this resistance, this block between the moms that really had an impact on the sons ultimately. And ultimately, I would argue the life outcome, certainly for Corey, or his ability to have a relationship with Yusuf. And so that was the part for me that it happened, I think in scene 2 or maybe 1, but I just continue to see kind of the images of that just continue to perpetuate itself throughout every single scene because he was loyal. And his loyalty as a friend is what put him there. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, just Dolores Wise, which was masterfully played by Niecy Nash, was incredibly moving and powerful, and it was beautiful to kind of watch her arc throughout. And again, we've been talking about the relationship between a mother and her children, kind of unprompted, but now like fully prompting it. And also just to have everyone watching, this week, one of the things that we learned from the previous week where we kind of veered a little bit from the conversation around the series itself, we're really focusing today on kind of the events of the series and then obviously the connections to our own personal lives. So you folks may notice that. Relationship between a mother and her children is one of legends, right? In the series, each of the boys had a mother, if not a mother figure in their lives. Each of their relationships were filled with love, which we've just noted. And in the way that was understood by each family, if not the world. Was there a moment or scene, again, going back to the series, that resonated with you as a woman, mom, or mother figure? And even if for those not a mom, but like we've assumed the motherly role, right? So I would love to maybe begin with Wisdom, and followed by Charmaine and Dinah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for me, watching the struggles that each of the moms felt around the various circumstances surrounding their son's incarceration, as was mentioned by Charmaine, was sort of a theme throughout. And I want to lift up, one of the moments for me, or there were several connected to this particular moment that for me, let me know how valuable the village of maternal love and womanly love for boys and men is. And it's the moment, I believe, when Kevin is in juvenile, and his family comes to see him. And you already know from the series that there is a tremendous amount of love for him that's exuded throughout the series. His sister, comes to his aid. She's the person who goes with him to the police station and talks with them and tries to help him through that particular set of circumstances. But there's a moment when they all go visit him and they're just sitting around talking about regular things that are happening in the outside world. And what you see in that scene is how much those women are trying to firm him up, lift him up, cover him with love and protection. And I think that that is emblematic of the ways in which Black women, brown women have circled up and around boys and men who are at risk or who are thrusted into systems that dehumanize them. And I was just floored by that display of unconditional love and the way in which Ava was able to capture that, moments even when there was no dialogue. There were just simple glances between Kevin and his sister and his mom, such as the when she picks him up from prison and he's finally released and she's bringing him home and she says, "I always pray that you hold on to that sweetness in you." And I think part of why he was able to was because he was covered, protected, surrounded by maternal, womanly love. And I think that that's a theme, I think, throughout brown and Black communities for the sustenance of our communities and for the solve that's necessary in the aftermath of such tragedies and traumas.
Absolutely, absolutely. Charmaine, was there a moment for you that resonated for you as a mom specifically?
Yeah, there certainly was. So Dinah, in your comments, she said something along the lines of like, when people go to prison, how it has an impact on families, right? Like it literally is not just the people who are inside the prison, right? But it's all of their families and the way they experience it. So I remember, and I don't remember if it was 2 or 3, but Corey's mom goes to visit him. And he needed money, for his own safety, like literally for his own safety. And I kept thinking of it, he needed to be safe on the inside, and that's why he needed money, but she needed to be safe on the outside. So they were having this real kind of tension between the two of them. And I found myself as a mom, just like, oh my God, like sympathizing with her because there was nothing she could do. She actually needed him, but he, this wonderful child that he was trying to find a way to still be there for his, he's like, it's okay, it's okay. And so again, I thought about his loyalty, like how his loyalty kept coming back to him kind of in that moment. And he was still trying to like make a way and make it all positive and still make her feel better inside of that, because he understood that it was a struggle for her too. And so I just found that as like this hugely powerful dynamic between like a mother and a son. As a mom to 2 sons who I think are extremely endearing and would do probably as much or even more for me if they needed to. It just really landed with me to watch that particular scene. So, yeah.
Yes, indeed. No doubt that Satch and Samir would do whatever they needed to do for their mom. And Dinah, I know that you have, I believe, 2 little ones also. So, but was there a scene that kind of tugged at you from, at kind of like with your mom lens and all that you are?
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, Wisdom, that scene, I was like, yes, because for all those reasons, right? I think that scene with Kevin and just that importance of village and just like stepping up, stepping down and knowing, right? And I mean, having to raise 2 very young boys at this point, 3 and 1, and both sets of grandparents being in Philly and in Chicago and us being here in Oakland, that extended community. And at what points do we just say, you know what, this is the village and this is how we're going to raise our kids. And if we need to step up or step back in order for them to get the needs that they have, I think that was powerful. And I think the other scene that really hasn't been mentioned that I wanted to lift was when Yusuf's mother said, something about they hate us, but we're not going to hate ourselves. That just really struck me because I immediately thought about at what point in my boy's life will I have to have this conversation, and the importance of being real, so that they're very aware of their reality and sort of what they face in the world, but also the importance of being loving and affirming, right? And so that tension between keeping it real and talking about race and talking about what can happen if the police stop you and why you shouldn't eat candy at the store because you may, this and this might happen, but then also just this incredible love, right? That I want them to be able to have a childhood they don't have to recover from. That's what I always tell people. And that is what I want more than anything for them. And it sounds simple and it sounds like we should all want that. but that is not always a given in our community. And so just to keep that front and center for me, and that comment that Yusuf's mom made really struck a chord for me.
Indeed. Before we move on to our next question, just a reminder for everyone, all of our attendees, to please, if you have questions for our esteemed panel, please send them to Chris Jackson via the Q&A tab on your Zoom link as we proceed. So this is an incredible panel of phenomenal women, and sisters supporting sisters is also something that is legend and definitely vital to the village. The moms, as it's been noted, some of the moms had relationships with each other, although many of them had no knowledge of the other's existence prior to the incident. Like, I'd love to just have a conversation on how, so as a man, I can say what I've observed in conversations is, and this happens with brothers also, right? Like, there are times that we show up for each other and there are times that we don't fully show up for each other. So how do we show up in support of each other differently to support, to kind of, continue to lift the village in different ways? And clearly there's examples of that in this series, but what are some other things that we need to continue to do to kind of uplift each other? And Charmaine, I'd love to start with you if that's okay.
Oh, thank you. I think to your point about the village, I think it's important for us always to support each other, the strongest of us and those of us who probably need a little bit more help at different times. I always say we can only be as strongest as our most struggling link, or your weakest link, or however you wanted to conceive of that. And so if we can't be there for each other kind of in times of crises as well as moments of celebration, I think that's, again, when you're tested is when it matters the most. I remember throughout one scene in the film, and I can't remember if the image that's showing is from, they were at a rally on the steps and they were handing out flyers, and there was a group of moms that were all together. And I believe when Corey's mom came up last to the group, she might've been the last, and then the group began to disperse. And there was clearly some tension that was existing between Yusuf's mom and Corey's mom inside of this scene. And it provoked in me this struggle that I've been having for probably the last several years about thinking about how women, particularly working women, women who are in the workplace, some of us are moms, but definitely those who are inside of workplaces, finding ways of being able to support each other inside of that, which makes us all stronger. It helps us all to be better working moms. It helps us all to be better wives and better partners and all of those things inside of our lives when you're supported inside of what you do. So finding ways to strengthen and uplift us, even when you're challenged, no matter what the conception is you have about what someone might be going through. It's in those moments when you're tested, in those moments when you're down, when you want to have the village around you, it's when you need it the most. So finding ways when it may seem like it's most challenging for you, when you feel like you can't connect, finding ways to kind of persist past that to be able to support everybody inside of the village.
Dinah, thoughts on how we show up to support each other differently, especially within times of trials and challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charmaine. Definitely agree with those comments. I mean, I think that one of the hardest things we have to do to support each other is to be able to just be authentic and truthful. And I'm just recalling, like, I was a first-time mom not too far along, right? And I was just surprised by how much stigma there were associated with certain things that were my reality, right? Miscarrying, having trouble breastfeeding, I could keep going. And I was just shocked and kind of angered at my sisterhood for not being so open about, for me having to like tell people to then tell me, and what that did, right? And now the importance of just keeping it real, like keeping it real with your children, keeping it real with each other. Like, this is not all roses, it's also thorns, and we have to name the thorns. Like, I think that's really, really hard, right? But we shouldn't have to work harder than we already work as women of color. And the only way that's going to happen is for us to show up as our authentic selves. to Charmaine's point, not just to friends and family, but in the workplace, right? Like that's real too, to not just say I'm running late, but like I'm running late because this happened to me in my life and I need this village to be here for me, and not be like, hey, you're late, right? Or like different examples. And so I think the other thing that is really impactful to me is I try to keep my kids as screen free as possible. And I'm laughing while I say that, is social media, right? Like, it is so easy. And I fall into this too, right? To just, it's all great and I'm loving the world and everything is handed to me and look at me, I'm doing so great. People don't want to talk about their depression, their mental health issues, the murder of their brother, or, I could keep going on media. And if they do, let's wrap ourselves around that. And if we don't, let's be vulnerable, because we have to be able to feel like our world shouldn't just be painted rosy, in order for us to feel validated. And I think that's a really important thing in today's day and age with social media, is try to watch that both in you and in others, and check in. Don't make assumptions when you don't see people on social media that they're fine, or just be as mindful as you can. I think we all need a little bit more mindfulness in that, like, I call it the spider sense, right? Of just being attuned, like to what's behind that smile, right? Or don't just ask, how are you, right? Ask how your soul is doing. Ask how your heart feels today, right? Those are like the real questions that'll get people to open up.
Absolutely. Wiz, I'll just turn it over to you, Wiz.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is a beautiful dialogue about the challenges that we face with being emotionally vulnerable. And this has been a challenge for communities of color in particular, because displaying emotional vulnerability puts us often at risk for future threat and insult and assault. And so for centuries, we have learned to cover over our pain, to not share those moments when we're in pain or when we feel emotionally vulnerable. And I get that, right, at a deep spirit level. But at the same time, that is behavior that is really associated with surviving. And we all know that survival tactics are only useful in the moments that you are immediately threatened. If you continue to use those same tactics when they're no longer serving you, then you actually cut yourself off from the emotional support that you need. What was interesting to me in the film and watching the dynamics between the moms and trying to support each other is just that internal tension we all feel when we're being threatened immediately, someone in our family is being threatened, and then we have this larger community to whom we are held accountable. And so the moms, I believe, at the root level, at a deep level, wanted to support each other. They wanted to be there for each other, wanted to make sure that all the boys were released and treated fairly. But, there is this really deep instinctual, thing that women feel, mothers feel, to protect their own. And so at that point, we began to see the splintering, between some of the moms in the series, and I imagine also in real life. And that's a real challenge. And I think the way to overcome that is to remember that as a community, as a village, we are in fact stronger together. Right? That actually when one person is in pain, we're all in pain, that our fates are in fact linked. And I think it's really, really hard to hold fast to that reality when one is suffering or when there is immediate threat to one's family or someone or to yourself. And, the only way for us to heal really is to tell the truth and shame the devil, which is what my mother used to tell me, right? We have to call a thing. And if we're in pain and needing support from folks in the village, we have to be willing to show up, as our full selves. One of the things I say often is that we can't show up armored and expect other people to come emotionally naked and vulnerable. And that's part of the social support seeking process for our communities. Like, we have to be willing to share, what we're feeling, to do it openly and honestly, and be willing to receive, the support that is made available to us. And recognizing, of course, that all of that is historically situated, right? That none of these dynamics were in fact created in communities of color. That part of the reasons we keep individuals emotionally at arm's length is because it helps us to survive.
Indeed. So a striking moment in the series for me was when Sherry Salam, Yusef Salam's mom, and Dolores Wise kind of ran into each other. Yusef was preparing to come home, Corey was going through what Corey was going through. Dolores tried to communicate that to Sharon and said, hey, a letter, could we get a letter to him? Is it possible? That would work wonders for Corey and his spirit, because he's having a hard time. And, she essentially was just like, yeah, no, because that can impact when Yusef comes out, and understanding that Yusef is her first and only priority in that moment. But I found it really difficult to watch that, right, in the same lens, right? It's just like, that was a very vulnerable moment, clearly, for Dolores, reaching out to another sister in that moment, and she not kind of reciprocating the love in that moment. Again, my child, as a father, my child's first, right? I'm taking care of my child first, but it just seemed quite harsh, and it was just a difficult scene to watch. And Wisdom, you talked a little bit about, you talked a lot about survival tactics, right? And this past week, my colleague, Andrew Frischman, had a conversation with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who is the pediatrician that discovered the Flint water crisis. And in her book, fascinatingly titled, What the Eyes Don't See, in the book, she says, quote, resilience isn't something that you're born with. It isn't a trait that you have or don't have. It's learned. And so often we focus on post-traumatic stress disorder. And I wonder about all of your thoughts on kind of this notion of post-traumatic resilience. And is there something that health professionals and educators can do to create conditions to help turn traumatic events, such as those events leading up to and while in prison, and even their reentry, for those of our young people who are in the juvenile justice system, into learned resilience? I'd love to start with you, Wisdom, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. And, as a trauma psychologist, I'm often talking to folks about the negative physiological, psychological implications of exposure to traumatic events. And so we know that these events have the capacity to disrupt biobehavioral development, to alter people's genetic blueprint, to change the way your immune systems respond. And so there is a real cost to the hits that are taken when individuals are exposed to trauma. And I think we have to acknowledge that first, because what I often think is that we're really, invested in moving from wound infliction to resilience narratives. And I recognize that as a people, especially as a village of communities of color, that we have incredible resilience to trauma. I mean, it is astounding to imagine that it hasn't been that long ago that folks were shackled and dehumanized on a daily basis for generations, and that they're still walking around in the world, creating, innovating, loving, being connected to other human beings. So it is indisputable that we have the capacity to bounce back. But what we don't talk about often is that the costs that are associated with that bounce back also need to be described, right? So there is a psychological cost to that kind of adaptation. Like, resilience doesn't just happen and people are just strong and made whole. Like, you actually have to go through some things to have the kind of resilience that can be sustained and actually can impact your life in a positive way. So yes, do individuals grow in the aftermath of trauma? I think all of us are an example of that capacity. Like, our foremothers, forefathers went through some things, and yet we are still here. We are standing, we are fighting for social justice. But at the same time, what we don't often give airspace to is the actual pain that people feel in the aftermath of these events and the implications for their well-being. So I love the conversation about trauma resilience. I believe in it. I believe people grow, but I do think that we have to take at face value that the hits that our boys and men and women and girls of color are experiencing is in fact real and comes with a price tag.
Indeed. Dinah, so I know in your body of work, working across multiple states, different schools, you being in Chicago, being in the Bay Area, you've encountered a number of young folks that have gone through this journey. would love to hear your thoughts in terms of this notion of, learned resilience and its relation to PTSD.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos. I mean, I really agree with Wisdom's comments. I mean, I think that oftentimes what's forgotten in this, in addition to just all of the things she articulated, was the process, right? That there is, it is, sometimes people make it like, okay, trauma and now snap back. I mean, we do this in our schools, right? We expect kids to witness what they witness out in the streets, and then just all of a sudden the bell rings and you should be in your seat. And it's not okay to come, angry or sad and so, I mean, I think it's all of the things that happen in between there that we need to be really mindful of, right? And how do we have the patience for the multiple levels of community, of resources, of time that it'll take to go through and navigate through all those stages. I mean, one of the things that struck me about this film was just Linda's relationship, just like her hidden bias from the beginning. It's beyond hidden bias. It was racism, and how many Lindas we have in our school systems right now as administrators, as teachers. And I've seen them, I have to say, right? Like as a teacher, I've had fellow teachers who have said things to me that have made me cringe, where I'm like, you should retire, you shouldn't be here. And I've seen administrators and the damaging effects that the suspension rates have had on Black and brown boys because it goes there, right? And all of the policies that are enacted. And so I think it's not just also about the Lindas, but it's about the systems that we create. And there's a lot of egregious injustices, right? So I think while I appreciate the perspective, because I think it's asset-based thinking, right? And so I think that oftentimes, you hear people say, "Oh, poor baby, his mom this. Oh, poor baby, his community, or he lives here," and sympathy is all they've got to give. And we've got to do better. We deserve better. We've got to have resources. We've got to listen, and we've got to heal. And so I think to just be mindful of that full perspective. And thinking through this, yes, we're resilient, but I think there's a nature and nurture here. It's not just a learned behavior, right? I mean, like, I carry the trauma of ancestors before me. And there's a lot of folks and a lot of trauma there, right? And how do we navigate through that? And so, again, while I agree with the framing, I think there's a lot of back end work that we need to do in order for us to actually walk that walk.
Absolutely. And despite the rhetoric that we may hear coming from different places, including the occupant of the chief seat in this land, our communities are not rat-infested spaces. They are places of great love and brilliance and light. Charmaine, would love to hear from you a little bit on this one around this learned resilience and PTSD. I know that you and your work, both at the foundation at LPI and even before that, has had different areas and times where you focused on this work. So we'd love to hear from you on this.
And I was a recent resident of the rat infested place.
Yes, you were.
I think it's amazing. I think it's an amazing city. But thanks. So two things that Dinah and Wisdom both said that really stuck with me. Dinah, I love being able to provide our children with a childhood that they don't have to bounce back from, right? Like if that could be the North Star that we're all shooting for, I would love that. And then hearing from Wisdom that the hits are real, because they are, and there's a real impact and the real cost. And I think sometimes we can admire the resiliency because we see it and we can all acknowledge that we're still standing and functioning and going off and creating all of these things, but never probably seeing the downside of that. Maybe that's the flip side to Dinah's comment about social media, about people always appearing as though they're one way, but we're, completely crazy inside because we've learned to deal with this. And because the hits are real, like learning how to cope with trauma and threats, certainly for children requires like supportive relationships, requires really seriously supportive relationships, and then opportunities to know how to navigate all of that, the skills to know how to navigate that. I think the other thing I kind of want to surface is that trauma isn't singular for most of the children. we work with, right? It is not, it's an ongoing life circumstance. And so how do you teach someone how to deal with their life in America really is the question. And I think about what I thought about, Carlos, and Dinah, I think, no, you weren't there, you missed it, but the work of the Deep Center in Savannah with the young students that they have there. And so the Deep Center is this project that really looks at restorative justice and works very heavily with students in Savannah, Georgia, and gives them opportunities to use writing as a way of communicating and dealing with some of the challenges that kids so often face in life. But the complementary piece to that is also then working with the adults inside of the system to get them to understand the cultural aspects of what they're experiencing and stop treating every infraction as though it warrants someone going to jail or having legal authorities otherwise brought in to deal with behaviors that are really common for adolescents. And so kind of inside of that, you get people to better understand kind of who you're working with, who you're policing with, but also giving students, giving children the ability to articulate the trauma that they're experiencing and having the skills to do so in ways that are more positive than sometimes the way we act out, right? Like behaviors, I always, say to people, if you can find ways of engaging kids, some of the behaviors, oftentimes those things will subside, but you got to find a way of connecting, which means you got to know me, it has to be relevant, and that takes time. Most people don't want to invest the time in people, right? The relationships are the thing that matters. The relationships are a way of getting through and helping students, children, young people better build resiliency in the life that they have in this country.
I
was just going to, Carlos, I mean, Charmaine, those points were so critically important because I think that we often don't think about the ways in which the relationships we form with children have such a possibility for being a solve to them in moments of trauma or in the aftermath of trauma, and having the patience to actually listen to them with a third ear and to speak to the wounds that are lying beneath the behavior, which I think is sometimes we don't take the time to do. But I also want to just say that there is something uniquely different about the ways in which boys and men express trauma symptomatology that we haven't really talked about, particularly boys of color. So boys and men of color may not have all of the emotional language to talk about the fact that what I'm feeling now is not really anger, but it's shame. And then how do we help equip young boys and young men with language with which to describe the pain that they are experiencing, to unpack their interior lives? And I think that that's something as a village we can do. We can stop telling our boys and men to, take it like a man, to walk it off and telling them that boys don't cry, and instead fill them up with gratitude for the fact that they've been brave enough to share with us their emotional pain and to believe them the first time. And I've often said that, for trauma resilience to occur, for trauma recovery, that boys and men of color don't necessarily need just safe spaces. They need brave spaces where they can show up, be visible, and have their pain be first validated, and where we can apply the appropriate wound care. And that takes us being responsive, patient, willing to listen to them when they're doing the absolute most in classrooms and in the world, to just hug them up and say to them really earnestly that I see you.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I completely, in the film, in the series, I remember Antron and the dad, he was struggling. He literally couldn't not find the words to communicate. The day he came to the cab and he stood at the cab and he was doing this whole thing and they're trying to move over because they thought he was going to get in the cab. And then he's sitting there looking like, what are you doing? Like, the kid didn't have the vocabulary, but more importantly, his father didn't, right? So you can see how these things are generational and they continue to perpetuate themselves if we don't figure out how to help people communicate what they're feeling.
Last week in the conversation with Chris and Donique, we asked Chris about, obviously he was the one person in our conversation that was father to a boy, son, Malcolm, and just kind of his reaction and response to some of those scenes, including the relationship between Bobby McCrae and Antron. And then Chris's wish was just for Malcolm just to continue to be able to be a child as long as he's able to, right? and not be forced to grow up too quickly. This whole notion of be tough, don't cry, act like a man. And then it reminded me of, I mean, I was fortunate enough to attend the My Brother's Keeper Rising event in Oakland this past spring, where there were hundreds of young brothers and hundreds of men. And what, outside of the programming, which is fabulous, and all the great conversations, the level of vulnerability that was shown by the men to the younger brothers was unlike a space I'd seen. I mean, I'm in a fraternity, you know, like we've had our convenings, but to that level and to that magnitude, I'd never seen it. And I feel like I'm certain that if there's anything those young brothers are going to walk away with, is some of those real honest conversations. And again, not just saying it's okay to do it, but also the modeling that's necessary, right? Like we can say it till we're blue in the face, but just the necessary modeling that we as adults have to do for our young folks. All right. Two quick things before, well, one more thing before we get to our Q&A. I just need to recognize a comment that I read here in the chat that was from Celeste Coleman that I just kind of want to read out to folks over here. So just, we as educators need to stop causing trauma to children, whether through microaggressions, direct comments, etc. Then our schools blame kids for the damage done by the trauma we inflicted. So just something to note for all of our educators. I know most of the folks that are following either on Facebook or on the Zoom are in some way in the education field. So just, if there's anything I definitely want to continue to drive home in this series is what our role is as educators in this work. So, okay. Chris Jackson, I'd like to throw it over to you I think we have time for one question from our attendees.
Yes, and let me first share this phenomenon that I suspect a lot of our attendees also experience. I realized my head was nodding a lot throughout the entire conversation, and then was constantly reminded that you actually couldn't see me. But I suspect that a lot of the folks on the line were doing a lot of this. I really appreciate the contributions to this conversation. I want to also try to pull something out of the chat, Carlos, and see if I can formulate the question perhaps that Nina was trying to ask. You bring up the conversation that Chris has with his son Malcolm, and this desire not only as mothers but as parents to sort of shield our children as much as we can to preserve their innocence. Is it possible to overshield, and as the result of something like that, the Central Park Five, and even more than that, balance? Can we prepare our children for the dangerous aspects of the world and also help them lead innocent, joyful lives? I guess I'll drop that deep question on you before we conclude tonight.
Well, I mean, I think I love the question. So here's what the data tell us and what I know just objectively being, you know, in the world as a woman, as a mom. You know, if we want to prepare our children for bias in the world, that's an important thing to do, but we can't do the preparation for bias without firming people, you know, our children up with messages about that fill them with pride, right? So if you just tell people, be wary of the world, our children, you know, folks are out to threaten you and you could be harmed, but without telling them that they're beautiful, wonders to behold, and that the fact that they're being subjected to that is not their responsibility or their fault, then we'll be leaving them particularly vulnerable. But I think what's most important is that we don't, you know, that all of our interventions for children who are traumatized are not, you know, about helping our children, you know, protect themselves from being killed in the world. You know, it can't be that, like, for you to go out in the world and like exist as a human being, you must do, you know, all of the following: talk softly, walk with your head bowed, don't wear a hoodie. That can't be the whole purpose of our interventions. We need structural intervention, structural change, so that when our boys and men and women and girls walk out in the world, that they are free to be human. But at the same time, I think that what we are struggling to do as parents all the time is balancing, how do we get our children back home? You know, how do we trust that when you go out in the world that you're going to actually make it home? And we can support each other in the village in having those conversations and developing strategies together that will protect our children in ways that we know the world won't.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in with a couple of things as well. I mean, I think, one is, of course, we need to have that balance, right? Of making sure that we affirm and love and also keep it real. And I would argue that we need to affirm and love and be a village more than we need to, right? Like tell them these other narratives and stories. And we also need to help them understand stories through powerful stories that are real, even fictional, I would say, because so many times we get caught up in the lecture, right? And I think that, as a mother to young kids, I mean, I've seen some amazing books, right, that talk about all kinds of things that are topics that most families would say, oh, I would never have that conversation right now. So I think the power in books and being able to tell those stories by people that they know, I think carries a lot for kids, and it sticks more than the research shows this, or I've seen police do this. So I think being able to balance that, being intentional in everything, I think as a parent, just to think about these things ahead of time of what am I doing and what conversations do I need to prepare you for if we're going to a protest, for example, right? And then the other is just the importance of code switching, right? That you don't always not have to wear a hoodie, right? Like, because then we don't want to have like all these no's on the world, right? I don't want my sons to navigate the world with all these no's, but being real about like, what are the contexts, right? That you're in, and how do we show up in this way, like authentically, but also understand the space that we're entering, right? Whether it's a basketball court or a school.
So I will plus one to both of those comments, because I think, affirmations and love and keeping it real with my children is certainly what I seek to do. I think the only other piece I would add is that our life is a story, right? My children knew their great grandmother, and their great grandmother had a story. Their grandparents learned how to swim probably 2 years ago. So there's a whole story behind how Granny learned how to swim 2 years ago, right? So if you talk about these things, I don't try to hit them with the heavy, but they live in the world. And so I have to prepare my children for the world in which they live. And so we've had conversations about Trayvon Martin. They do own a hoodie. We understand when and where you should use it and when and where, like what people think about that. Like it's not their beliefs, but like understanding and being aware. And I don't know when it's too early. I literally don't know when it's too early to begin to have conversations with your children about the things that matter in the world. I remember the first time the pediatrician told me I had to talk about like friendly hands or unfriendly hands. My children barely could speak. And so these things usually need to happen before most adults are ready for them to happen, is the way I would say. So, end it there.
Indeed. I cannot begin to just emphasize how much I appreciate each one of your contributions, your voices to this conversation. It's a conversation that needs to continue. I'm encouraging all of our attendees to please, again, one of the purposes of the series that Ava has just kind of stated repeatedly is that it's not just about us being emotional, being sad, and getting angry about it, but it's about what we're going to do with this once we watch the series, and what are we going to do with those emotions, and it's just to continue to have conversations with other folks. So just really encouraging folks that just to continue to talk to whoever, if someone hasn't seen it, encourage them to watch it, right? Whether if they feel like they need to or can binge watch it, I don't know how, I wasn't able to. And I know most of us were not able to do that, or just take your time in watching the series, but it is a series that absolutely needs to be watched, and it absolutely needs to be discussed. So we will continue to discuss this every Sunday for the next 3 Sundays at the same time, same channel. So again, just Dinah, Charmaine, Wisdom, thank you for just being here, just for sharing your insights and your brilliance with us. And for all the folks that took time out on this Sunday evening to join us for the second of 5 conversations. Please join us next Sunday, August 4th, 9 p.m., and we'll continue the conversation with a distinguished panel of leaders in law enforcement, folks from the judicial system, and folks charged with supporting people's re-entry after being released from prison. It's a conversation you absolutely will not want to miss. But remember, to participate, you'll need to register for that session in advance. And to do so, please go to bigpicture.org and go to our blog section for more information. Before we wrap completely, just need to give a huge shout out that this last Friday was the birthday of a king. Corey King Wise celebrated his birthday this past Friday. So just feel like that should be known and out there to the world. Happy birthday, King. To everyone else, look forward to seeing you next week. Peace.
Take care.
Good, everyone.
Hi, thank you.